She was supposed to die before the sun ever rose on her wedding day. But sometimes fate refuses to follow the plans written for it. 5 years after a single night changed an entire kingdom, one forgotten servant will cross paths with an Alpha King, haunted by a loss he has never understood. Neither of them knows that the truth buried all those years ago is still alive, and so is the person everyone believes is gone. If you love Alpha Kings, destined mates, hidden identities, and unforgettable fantasy romance, subscribe and stay with us. Tonight's story is only the beginning. 5 years after the Alpha King buried his bride, the woman everyone believed dead was kneeling on a kitchen floor, scrubbing stone with hands that had long forgotten silk. Eleanor Ravenshade had been a queen once, if only for a single night, and now she was nobody, a maid among maids, unremarkable by design. The calluses on her palms felt almost like armor, proof that the girl who once dreamed of crowns had learned, slowly and deliberately, to dream of nothing at all. Ambition was dangerous, invisibility was safer, and for 5 years, invisible was exactly what she had chosen to be. One quiet morning stitched to the next until the past felt like something that had happened to someone else entirely. She rarely let herself revisit the wedding, the golden hall, the vows spoken beneath a full moon, the wine that tasted faintly of almonds she should have questioned. Something in that feast stole the strength from her body before she understood what was happening, her knees buckling as the celebration collapsed into screams around her. The last thing she remembered was Kyle's face turning toward her, unreadable in the chaos, before the world folded into darkness. When she woke, she learned what the poison had truly been, and worse, she learned who the whole realm believed had put it in her cup. A political marriage grown inconvenient, they whispered. A queen quietly erased by the very king who married her. Betrayal, after all, rarely announces itself before it strikes. She woke to the memory of arms, strong, frantic, carrying her weight through darkness, while her own body refused to obey her. "Stay with me," a voice kept saying, low and shaking. "If they find you breathing, they'll finish the job." Agnes Whitmore had been head of staff at the palace for decades, and something in the older woman had refused to let an innocent girl die for a crime she never understood. She hid Elena beneath sacks of grain in a servant's cart, pressing a trembling hand over her mouth when soldiers passed too close, whispering prayers to a goddess she wasn't sure was listening. By the time the danger passed, Agnes had already decided what needed to happen next. A new name, a borrowed face, a life built far from anywhere a Nightfang soldier might think to look. The years that followed became something Elena hadn't expected to find twice, a kind of happiness built from small, ordinary things. Mornings meant kneading bread beside Agnes while the older woman hummed off-key, flour dusting both their sleeves, laughter slipping out before either of them noticed it had started. Afternoons meant gathering eggs from hens that scattered and squawked at her ankles, or drying bundles of lavender and rosemary along the kitchen rafters until the whole house smelled like something safe. There were evenings by the hearth when Agnes told stories that had nothing to do with kings or courts, and Elena let herself laugh without flinching at the sound of her own voice. Destiny, she had decided somewhere in those quiet years, was a luxury for people who hadn't already been discarded by it. She wanted nothing from fate anymore, only this, the modest, unremarkable safety of being forgotten. Then came the morning everything cracked open. Agnes burst into the kitchen with a letter still trembling in her hand, her face pale in a way Eleanor had never seen in 5 years of quiet mornings together. "The Alpha King is coming," she said, and the words landed like a struck bell, vibrating through every corner of the room until the flour on Elena's hands felt suddenly heavy as stone. For 5 years that title had lived only in memory, in nightmare, in the scar hidden beneath her sleeve. And now it was walking straight toward the door she had built her second life behind. Worse news arrived within the hour. Elena herself would be assigned to serve him directly, chosen among the staff for her quiet efficiency and the unremarkable face the old charm had given her to survive. She told herself the spell would hold. She repeated it while pressing wrinkles from her uniform, while practicing how to keep her eyes low and her hands steady, while her heart hammered a rhythm that had nothing to do with fear of punishment and everything to do with facing a man she still, despite everything, dreamed about in the dark. When the summons finally came, she walked the corridor like it belonged to someone else's legs, and stopped in front of the receiving hall doors with her palm hovering just above the cold brass handle. One breath, then another, On the other side of that door stood the man she believed had tried to destroy her, and there was no more time left to convince herself of anything at all. Kyle Nightfang entered the receiving hall like a storm that had learned to walk quietly, and every servant in the room seemed to shrink half a step without meaning to. He was taller than the stories made him sound, broad through the shoulders in a way that spoke less of vanity and more of a man who had spent years training for a war he never wanted. Black wool draped his frame from collar to boot, unbroken by any color, unbroken by any crest but the wolf sigil at his throat. His eyes moved across the room once, methodical, unreadable, the eyes of a king cataloguing threats out of habit rather than expectation. When he finally sat, he did it slowly, like a man lowering himself into a chair that had never once felt comfortable. Eleanor kept her gaze fixed on the pitcher in her hands, watching the wine tremble against the silver rim because her fingers wouldn't stay still. Every instinct in her screamed to bolt, to disappear back into the kitchen, where 5 years of careful invisibility still felt solid beneath her feet. Instead, she stepped forward, the way any maid would, and turned the goblet a quarter turn before pouring, an old habit from another life, angling the crest away from the guest, the way palace protocol once demanded of her. "Wine, my lord," she said, steadier than she had any right to expect. She didn't look up. She didn't dare. That was when he looked at her. Really looked. The way no one had looked at her in 5 years. His gaze caught on her hands first, on the small, precise turn of the goblet, and something in his jaw tightened like a man who'd heard a familiar song in an unfamiliar room. "No servant turns the crest away from a guest," he said quietly. "Only someone raised inside a royal court serves wine that way." The question landed heavier than it should have for something so small. "I was trained in a great house, my lord," she managed, the lie smooth from years of practice, though her pulse hammered loud enough she was certain he could hear it. He didn't touch the wine. His hand rested near the goblet, fingers still, and Eleanor noticed the same stillness she'd seen in her own hands every time someone offered her a cup back at the cottage. She had never touched wine again after that night either. Not once in 5 years. Watching him avoid it now, jaw set like the smell alone cost him something, she wondered for the first time whether his silence carried the same wound hers did. Not guilt, something closer to grief that had never been allowed to heal. She noticed other things too. The way he thanked the boy who cleared his plate. The way he waved off a servant's apology for a spilled glass instead of letting his temper show. The way his voice gentled when he spoke to the youngest maid in the room, a girl barely past 13 who trembled just being near him. A king who terrorized a kingdom didn't bother being kind to children who couldn't repay him for it. Eleanor found herself standing very still near the doorway, turning that thought over and over until it didn't fit anywhere she'd stored it before, until the careful architecture of hatred she'd built for 5 years developed its first hairline crack. He rose to leave as the meal ended, cloak settling back over broad shoulders, already half turned toward the door. And then he stopped, eyes finding her again across the room, sharper now, more deliberate. "Who is that maid?" he asked the steward beside him, voice low but not low enough, and Elena's heart slammed once against her ribs so hard she nearly dropped the pitcher in her hands. The steward leaned closer and whispered the answer. Kyle's expression didn't soften. If anything, the crease between his brows deepened, as though the explanation had only raised more questions than it answered. Elena couldn't hear a single word, but whatever the steward had said, it hadn't satisfied him. He walked out without another glance, and didn't stop looking back at that doorway until it had closed completely behind him. Elena found Agnes in the herb garden that evening, kneeling among the rosemary with dirt under her nails, and something about the ordinary peace of the scene made her chest ache before she even opened her mouth. "He didn't recognize me," she said, dropping to sit on the cold stone beside her, "but he looked at me like he wanted to." Agnes didn't stop working the soil, though her hands slowed. "What do you know about him, Agnes?" "Really know, not rumors." The older woman was quiet long enough that Elena thought she wouldn't answer at all. "He never remarried," Agnes said finally, brushing dirt from her palms. 5 years, and the court has thrown a dozen daughters of nobility at his feet. He's turned away every single one." Elena's breath caught somewhere behind her ribs. Turned them away how? Politely, coldly, however it took. Agnes met her eyes for the first time since the conversation started. something careful and searching in her expression. A king without an heir is a kingdom without a future, Elena. Every advisor he has begged him to move on. He hasn't listened to a single one of them. Maybe he prefers his freedom, Elena said, though the words tasted false even as she spoke them. Agnes shook her head slowly. He's worn black every day since your funeral. Not grey, not silver, black, head to boot, 5 years running. The staff who travelled with him say he hasn't touched another colour since the day they buried an empty coffin in your name. The image struck harder than Elena expected. A man dressing himself in grief every single morning like it was armour he refused to remove. That doesn't sound like a man who wanted me gone, she whispered. Agnes opened her mouth as if to say something more, then closed it again, her hands going still over the rosemary. For a heartbeat she looked less like a woman remembering the past, and more like someone deciding how much of it Elena was ready to survive. There are things I know, she said carefully, and things I only suspect. I won't hand you a suspicion dressed up as truth. Elena wanted to press, wanted to shake the rest loose, but something in Agnes's face told her this door would only open when the older woman decided it should, not a moment sooner. She thought back to the wedding night in pieces now, turning each memory over like a stone she'd never examined closely enough. The wine, the almonds, Kyle's face turning toward her in the chaos, not smug, not satisfied, but confused, alarmed, reaching for her before the crowd swallowed them both. She'd spent 5 years remembering that expression as the mask of a man watching his plan succeed. What if it had been something else entirely? What if she'd built an entire second life on a story someone else had handed her, never once questioning who benefited from her believing it? Agnes, she said slowly, the question forming before she was ready for the answer. Who told you Kyle did this? Who told you he was the one who poisoned me? Agnes's face changed, just slightly, just enough for Elena to catch it. A flicker of something that looked uncomfortably close to guilt. It was already the story everyone believed by the time I found you, Agnes said carefully, too carefully, her eyes sliding away toward the garden gate, as though the answer lived somewhere beyond it. Elena stared at her, the herb garden suddenly feeling very small, very cold. Maybe, she said quietly, testing the words like a wound she hadn't touched in years. I've spent 5 years hating the wrong man. Elena found Kyle by accident, in the way that important things always seem to happen. She'd gone to the east wing to collect linens and stopped cold at the sound of a voice she recognized, low and unguarded, coming from behind a half-open door. Through the gap, she could see him standing alone at the window, moonlight cutting sharp lines across his face, a glass of water untouched on the sill beside him. He wasn't performing for anyone. That was what stopped her feet from carrying her past, the rare, unbearable sight of a king with no audience at all. 5 years, he said quietly, to no one, to the empty room, to whatever ghost lived in that window. 5 years, and I still can't walk past the east garden without seeing you there. His hand pressed flat against the glass, and Elena's chest tightened at the rawness in his voice, a grief that clearly hadn't dulled with time the way grief was supposed to. She knew she should leave. She knew watching this was a kind of theft, but her feet had rooted to the floor, and some traitorous part of her needed to hear what came next. I told myself I'd protect you, he continued, voice fracturing on the last word. I told your father I'd keep you safer than any guard could. He pressed his palm harder against the glass, as if it could hold him upright. You begged me for time, that last night. Said you needed air, needed space from the crowd, and I let you go because I thought you were only frightened. I thought, given a season, you'd learn to love this place the way I wanted you to. His voice dropped lower, rougher. I never once imagined you believed there was no door out of that marriage except the one you chose. Elena went very still against the frame, the words settling into her like stones dropped one by one into a well she hadn't known was that deep. He hadn't poisoned her. He'd spent 5 years believing something far crueler, that she'd looked at the life he offered her and chosen to end her own, rather than live it. Some king, he said, laughing without a trace of humor in it, who couldn't even see his own bride drowning until it was already too late to pull her out. The self-loathing in his voice was a physical thing, heavy enough that Elena felt it land somewhere in her own chest, an old ache answering a new one she hadn't expected to feel on his behalf. Her hand found the doorframe before her mind caught up to what she was doing, fingers curling against old wood, one step away from ending this entire charade with 3 words. She could walk in. She could say her name. She could watch 5 years of guilt lift off his shoulders in a single breath. The urge was so strong it frightened her, a pull she hadn't felt since the night Agnes first told her to disappear, and for one dangerous heartbeat, she let herself imagine his face if she said it. Relief, disbelief, and then, close behind them both, terror, because the instant she said her name, whoever had failed to kill her once would learn exactly where to find her to finish the job. She stepped back from the door as quietly as she'd approached it, her pulse a war drum in her ears, one truth settling into her chest like a stone dropped into still water. Whatever happened next, she couldn't reveal herself yet. Not until she understood who had truly poisoned that wine, and whether they were still close enough to try again. For the second time in 5 years, Elena chose to disappear. The banquet hall glittered with candlelight and forced laughter. Nobles from 3 provinces gathered to toast an alliance nobody in the room actually trusted, and Elena moved through it all with a wine pitcher balanced against her hip, invisible in the way she'd trained herself to be. She was 3 tables from the head of the room when Cale's goblet touched his lips, and 2 heartbeats later, his hand found the table's edge like a man losing his footing on solid ground. It happened fast. His face drained of color first, then his breathing turned shallow and wrong, a fine sheen of sweat breaking across his brow though the hall was cool. A noblewoman gasped. Someone called for a physician, but Elena was already moving, the pitcher forgotten on the nearest table, drawn forward by something she couldn't yet name, only the certainty that she'd seen this exact grey creeping across skin before. She reached him and made herself look properly, the way Agnes had taught her to look at a wilting herb before deciding whether it could be saved. The tremor in his hands first, fine and involuntary, then his lips, faintly blue at the edges. She leaned close to the abandoned goblet and caught it, that same ghost of almond sweetness hiding under the wine, bitter beneath the bitterness, exactly like the taste that had haunted the back of her throat on her wedding night. The pieces locked into place all at once, 5 years of buried memory surfacing in a single breath. Silverleaf root, she said, mostly to herself, disbelief and recognition arriving in the same instant. Ground and strained until the bitterness disappears. "Don't call the physician," she said, and her voice came out with an authority that startled even her, cutting clean through the rising panic. "There isn't time. Get him water now, and something with iron in it, a blade, anything." A guard hesitated, unwilling to take orders from a maid, until Cale's eyes rolled back and his knees buckled, and suddenly no one cared who was giving instructions as long as someone was. Elena caught his weight before he hit the floor, his head heavy against her shoulder, and beneath the panic in the room, she felt something colder settle into her chest. Recognition, and underneath it, fury. She grabbed the iron candlestand from the nearest table and pressed the cool metal to his lips. An old trick Agnes had drilled into her during her recovery years ago, one meant to force a reaction that could buy precious minutes. He gasped, coughed, and, mercifully, breathed. By the time the physician arrived, Kyle's color had steadied enough that he was conscious again, disoriented, blinking up at the face bent over his. His hand found her wrist, weak but deliberate, some animal part of him recognizing safety in her grip, even through the haze. "Wait," he rasped, barely more than breath, fingers tightening as though letting go of her meant losing something he couldn't afford to lose twice. Elena froze, torn between every instinct that told her to pull free and the one raw, aching part of her that didn't want to. She eased her wrist free only once the physician's hands replaced her own, stepping back into the crowd of servants before anyone thought to ask why a maid had known what to do when trained healers hadn't yet arrived. Alone in the narrow servants' corridor afterward, her back pressed to cold stone, she finally let her hands shake. Whoever had poisoned her 5 years ago hadn't stopped hunting. They'd simply changed their target. Or perhaps, she realized with a chill that had nothing to do with the corridor's draft, they'd never stopped hunting either of them at all. Someone inside that glittering hall had tried to kill the Alpha King tonight, and once, long ago, that same someone had tried to kill her. 2 victims of 1 patient, unfinished conspiracy. And now Elena understood, with a certainty that settled cold and final in her chest, that she couldn't wait for the truth to surface on its own. She would have to go looking for it herself, quietly, before whoever held that poison decided to try a third time. The fever took hold of Kyle by midnight, his body fighting the last traces of poison the physicians hadn't fully drawn out, and somehow, through some argument with the head healer that Elena still wasn't sure how she'd won, she found herself at his bedside with a basin of cool water and a cloth she pressed to his burning forehead. He thrashed against sheets already damp with sweat, muttering fragments that made no sense, and Agnes had warned her before she left the room. Fever loosens tongues, that grief keeps locked. Elena hadn't understood what that meant until his hand closed around hers in the dark. "Don't leave," he said, eyes glassy, unfocused, seeing something that wasn't the ceiling above him. "You always leave before I can say it properly." His grip tightened, desperate in a way that had nothing to do with strength and everything to do with fear. Elena's breath caught somewhere in her throat, torn between the urge to soothe him and the terrible stillness of realizing he wasn't speaking to a maid at all. He was speaking to a ghost he didn't know was kneeling right beside him. "Elena," he whispered, and her name in his mouth landed like a struck bell, the first time she'd heard it spoken aloud in this castle in 5 years. "Elena, I knew the moment I saw you at the altar. I knew what you were to me before the priest finished a single word." His fingers traced weakly along her wrist, tracking some old memory his fevered mind had confused with the present. "Mate," he breathed, barely audible. "You were always my mate. I felt it the instant our eyes met. And I said nothing, because I was afraid you'd run from a bond you never asked for." Elena sat frozen, the cloth forgotten in her free hand, water dripping cold down her wrist while something far hotter moved through her chest. A mate bond. Not a political marriage arranged for advantage, not a king claiming a bride for convenience. A true bond, recognized and then deliberately buried, because he'd wanted to earn her instead of simply owning her. 5 years of believing herself unwanted cracked open around that single fevered confession, and she understood with sudden, dizzying clarity why he'd never remarried, why he wore black, why he visited an empty grave and spoke to it like she could still hear him. He hadn't just loved her, he'd recognized her, soul deep, and then watched her die before he ever found the courage to say so. The words rose in her throat unbidden. "I'm here. I never died. Look at me." And her lips had nearly shaped the first syllable of her own name when the door opened behind her, and Agnes stepped inside, took one look at the scene, and went pale. "Not like this," Agnes said quietly, urgently, crossing the room in 3 swift steps. "Elena, if you tell him now, feverish and half out of his mind, he won't remember it as truth come morning. He'll remember it as a dream, and you'll have spent your only advantage for nothing." Elena's hand hovered inches from his, the confession still burning on her tongue, and she hated how much sense the older woman made. She pulled back slowly, releasing his hand as gently as she could manage, watching his fingers curl into the empty sheets, like they were still searching for something to hold. "We find the traitor first," Agnes said, voice low and steady, the same voice that had once carried Elena out of a wedding hall soaked in poison. "Then you tell him everything, safely, as yourself, not as a secret confessed to a fevered king who won't remember your face by dawn." Elena nodded, though every instinct in her screamed to stay, to speak, to finally end 5 years of carrying a truth alone. Instead, she stood at the edge of his bed a moment longer, watching him settle into uneasy sleep, still murmuring her name, and made herself a promise instead of a confession. Whoever had poisoned that wine would be found, and only then would she let herself belong to him again. The Queen Mother arrived 3 days later in a procession of black carriages and colder silence, and the entire castle seemed to hold its breath the moment she stepped through the gates. Eleanor had heard the servants whisper about her for years, a woman who'd buried a husband and outlived 2 wars, sharp enough to smell a lie before it finished forming. Within an hour of her arrival, she'd summoned every servant who'd been near the banquet table the night of the poisoning, and Elena stood in that line with her pulse hammering, painfully aware that the woman's eyes lingered on her longer than they lingered on anyone else. "You," the Queen Mother said, not raising her voice, not needing to. The maid who knew exactly what herb had been used before any physician arrived. "Tell me how a servant comes to possess that particular knowledge." The accusation hung in the air unspoken but unmistakable, and Elena felt the ground shift beneath her. 5 years of careful invisibility collapsing under a single pointed question. "I've tended herb gardens all my life, my lady," she managed, and it wasn't a lie, only a smaller truth, wearing a larger one's clothes. The Queen Mother's expression didn't change. "How convenient," she said, "that the one person capable of identifying silverleaf root happened to be standing close enough to administer it." Word of the accusation reached Kyle before Elena did, and by the time she was summoned to his chambers, still weak from fever but sharp-eyed again, she found him standing rather than lying, dressed and pacing, a man clearly caught between instinct and evidence. "My mother believes you poisoned me," he said without preamble, watching her face the way he'd watched it since the very first night, searching for something he still couldn't name. "I don't." The certainty in his voice startled her, not blind loyalty but something steadier, older, a conviction he seemed to trust more than he understood. "Then help me prove it," Elena said. "Whoever did this is still inside these walls, and they won't stop until one of us is dead." The investigation moved carefully over the following days, guards combing the castle records while Kyle himself questioned the household staff, patient in a way Elena hadn't expected from a king. It was the wine steward who finally broke the silence, admitting under pressure that a delivery of rare paper, the kind used only by the royal apothecary, had gone missing from the stores weeks before the banquet. The trail led from the steward's ledgers to a locked study 2 corridors from the throne room, a study belonging to a man who'd stood 2 steps from power his entire life and never once been close enough to touch it. Lord Varric, cousin to the Queen Mother. Inside that study, behind a false panel in the wall, the guards found what they needed, a small pouch of ground silverleaf root, still wrapped in apothecary paper, and beneath it, letters written in a hand Elena didn't recognize, but Kyle clearly did. She watched something harden behind his eyes as he read them, the words on the page rearranging 5 years of history into a shape neither of them had ever suspected. When Varric was finally brought before them, flanked by guards, he took one look at the evidence laid across the table and understood, with visible and immediate clarity, that there was no version of this conversation where he walked away untouched. "Very well," he said at last, chin lifting, any pretense of innocence abandoned. "Your father's line was never meant to rule forever," he told Kyle, no shame in his voice at all. "I poisoned the bride first because a grieving king is easier to manipulate than a married one, and I would have finished the job tonight if this maid hadn't interfered twice now." The word "twice" landed in the room like a struck bell, and every eye turned to Elena, Kyle's included, confusion breaking slowly across his face as understanding crept in behind it, question forming on his lips before he could stop it. She could have stayed silent. She could have let the moment pass and slipped back into the safety of being no one, the way she'd trained herself to do for 5 careful years. Instead, she stepped forward into the space between accusation and truth and reached up to pull the pin from her hair. The old charm dissolved the way Agnes had once taught her it could, features shifting, softening, until the face beneath was one Kyle hadn't seen outside of memory and grief for 5 long years. "It's me," she said quietly, into a silence so complete she could hear her own heartbeat. "I never died. I've been alive this whole time, hiding, because I believed you were the one who wanted me gone." Kyle didn't move. For one long, suspended moment he only stared at her, his eyes tracing her face like a man relearning something he'd thought lost forever, disbelief and hope colliding somewhere behind his expression, and neither one winning yet. Slowly, almost afraid of what his own hand might find, he lifted it and reached toward her, not closing the distance himself, only offering, as though some part of him still couldn't trust this wasn't a fever dream, returning to torment him one final time. Elena stepped forward and pressed her palm against his, felt the warmth and the tremor in his fingers, and watched the last of his disbelief finally give way. Only then did he cross the remaining distance and pull her into arms that shook with 5 years of grief, finally allowed to break. Justice for Varric came swift and merciless, the Queen Mother's cold fury turning fully against her own blood, once the truth stood undeniable in front of her, and the court, that had once buried an empty coffin, now scrambled to make sense of a queen risen from the dead. But none of that mattered to Elena in that moment. Not the trials that would follow, not the reckoning still owed. Only the feel of Kyle's hand cradling the back of her head, like he was afraid she might vanish again if he loosened his grip even slightly. 5 years, he murmured against her hair, voice breaking on the words. 5 years I mourned you every single day, and you were alive, and you were here, and I never— He stopped, pulled back just far enough to look at her properly, and something in his expression shifted from disbelief into a quiet, fierce certainty. I'm not letting you disappear again. Not for anyone. Not for anything. Elena pressed her palm flat against his chest, feeling the frantic beat of his heart beneath it, and understood, finally, completely, that the man she'd spent 5 years mourning as a monster had never stopped being exactly what he'd promised her at the altar. A protector, a mate, hers. But even as relief settled through her like warmth after a long winter, one thought remained, quiet and unshaken beneath the joy. Varric hadn't acted alone, building a conspiracy that ran 5 years deep into the bones of the court, and somewhere in that castle, the last loose thread of the plot against them both was still waiting to be pulled. Under the same moon that once witnessed their darkest night, Eleanor and Cale finally found their way back to each other. Not because the road was easy, but because some bonds refuse to break, no matter how much time, fear, or betrayal stands between them. Maybe life has made you feel invisible too. Maybe you've wondered if you were ever truly seen, truly chosen, truly loved. If this story reminded you that hope can survive even the longest winter, then don't let this be our last journey together. Subscribe, turn on the bell, and join us for more unforgettable fantasy romances filled with alpha kings, destined mates, hidden truths, and second chances. Until our next story, may the moon always guide you home.